The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana prairie as Dr. Rebecca Chun adjusted her field equipment for another day of research. She had been studying the native grass restoration project here for 3 months now, documenting how the land was slowly healing after decades of overgrazing. The work was solitary but meaningful. Each tiny seedling she cataloged represented hope for the prairie's future. Rebecca loved these quiet mornings before the summer heat became unbearable. The endless grassland stretched toward the horizon, broken only by gentle hills and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. She could hear meadowlarks singing in the distance and feel the constant prairie wind tugging at her sun hat as she knelt to examine a cluster of native wildflowers. Movement on the ridge caught her eye. A lone rider on horseback moved along the traditional trail that ran between the research area and the northern Cheyenne reservation. From this distance, she could make out the rider's dark hair flowing behind him as his horse moved at a steady pace across the landscape. The sight wasn't unusual. She often saw members of the nearby tribe traveling these ancient paths that had been used for generations. Rebecca had always felt a deep respect for the indigenous connection to this land, though she had never had much opportunity to interact with the tribal community during her research work. She was about to return to her plant samples when something unusual happened. As the rider guided his horse down a steeper section of the trail, she saw something fall from him, a small object that caught the morning light as it tumbled toward the ground. The rider continued on, apparently unaware of what he had dropped. Curiosity got the better of her scientific focus. Rebecca gathered her tools and began walking toward where she thought the object had fallen. The prairie grass was tall here, making it difficult to spot anything small. She spent nearly 20 minutes searching, moving in careful grid patterns the way she had been trained to survey plant populations. Finally, nestled among the stems of buffalo grass, she found it. Her breath caught as she realized what lay before her, a magnificent eagle feather, golden brown with distinctive markings that spoke of its origin from a mature bird. The feather was pristine, clearly well cared for, with small leather bindings at its base that suggested ceremonial importance. Rebecca had studied enough about indigenous cultures during her graduate work to understand that eagle feathers held deep spiritual significance for Native American tribes. She knew they weren't just decorative items, but sacred objects earned through acts of honor and bravery. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully lifted the feather, treating it with the reverence she instinctively knew it deserved. Wrapping the feather gently in a clean cloth from her field kit, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. Rather than simply leaving it where she found it or hanging it on a fence post like lost property, she felt compelled to return it personally to its owner. The rider had headed toward the reservation boundary, and she knew there was a small trading post there where many tribal members conducted business. The walk to the trading post took her nearly an hour across terrain she rarely explored. The building itself was modest, weathered wood siding and a covered porch where several pickup trucks were parked. Hand-painted signs advertised traditional crafts, hunting supplies, and cold drinks. Rebecca felt nervous as she approached, unsure of the proper protocol but determined to do the right thing. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of leather and sage. The shelves were lined with everything from canned goods to handmade jewelry. An elderly woman behind the counter looked up with mild curiosity at this obvious outsider. "Excuse me," Rebecca began hesitantly. "I'm the researcher working on the prairie restoration project nearby. I found something that I believe belongs to one of your community members, someone who was riding the Ridge Trail this morning." Before the woman could respond, the door chimed and a young man entered. He was tall and lean, with long black hair partially braided and wearing worn jeans and a faded rodeo t-shirt. Something about his bearing suggested he was the rider she had seen. "Thomas!" The older woman called to him in English, then continued in what Rebecca assumed was Cheyenne. The young man's eyes immediately went to Rebecca, then to the carefully wrapped bundle in her hands. "You found something?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. Rebecca nodded and slowly unwrapped the cloth, revealing the eagle feather. The change in Thomas's expression was immediate and profound relief. gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "My grandfather's feather," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had lost it forever." The older woman behind the counter spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, and Rebecca caught the tone of approval in her words even without understanding the language. Thomas carefully took the feather, holding it as if it were made of the most delicate glass. "This belonged to my grandfather, Joseph Crowfeather," Thomas explained, his initial wariness giving way to openness. "He was a medicine man, respected by our people. This feather was earned through his service to the tribe, and when he passed last year, it came to me along with certain responsibilities." Rebecca listened intently as Thomas continued. "I serve as a messenger for our tribal council, carrying communications between the elders in different communities. My grandfather always said this feather would give me strength and wisdom for that role. When I realized it was gone..." He paused, shaking his head. "I felt like I had failed not just him, but my entire people." "I'm so glad I found it then," Rebecca said sincerely. "I could tell it was something important. I've been learning about the spiritual significance of eagle feathers in native cultures." Thomas studied her face for a moment as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "Most people wouldn't have bothered to return it, or they would have kept it as some kind of trophy. Eagles are sacred to us. Their feathers connect us to the Creator and to the spirits of our ancestors." The older woman, who Thomas introduced as his Aunt Louise, brought them both cold drinks and gestured toward a small seating area near the window. What had started as a simple return of lost property was becoming something deeper, a bridge between two very different worlds. "Tell me about your research," Thomas said, as they settled into the worn but comfortable chairs. "Aunt Louise says you've been working out on the prairie for months." Rebecca found herself opening up about her work, explaining how she was documenting the recovery of native plant species and studying the complex relationships between different grasses, wildflowers, and the wildlife that depended on them. Thomas listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that showed his own deep understanding of the land. "My people have always known these things," he said thoughtfully. "The old ones could read the health of the prairie like a book. They knew which plants grew together, which ones came back first after fire, how the buffalo and the grass needed each other." As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca realized she was experiencing something remarkable. Here was someone who understood the land from a completely different perspective than her scientific training had given her, yet their knowledge complemented each other in surprising ways. Thomas spoke of traditional ecological wisdom passed down through generations, while Rebecca shared data about soil composition and plant genetics. The connection between them was immediate and profound, not romantic, but the deep recognition of two people who cared passionately about the same landscape for different but equally valid reasons. Rebecca felt her understanding of the prairie expanding beyond charts and measurements to include the spiritual and cultural dimensions she had never fully grasped. As the sun began to set, Thomas carefully secured his grandfather's eagle feather in a beaded pouch at his side. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've returned more than just a feather today. You've restored my faith in my ability to serve my people with honor." Rebecca smiled, feeling that she had gained something precious too, a glimpse into a way of seeing the world that would forever change how she approached her work. Neither of them could have imagined that this chance encounter would soon become crucial to the survival of the very land they both cherished. Rebecca was analyzing soil samples in her small field laboratory when the phone rang. It was her supervisor from the university, Dr. Patricia Williams, calling with news that made her stomach drop. "Rebecca, have you seen the local news today? There's been a major development regarding the land adjacent to your research area." Rebecca hadn't checked the news in days, too absorbed in her work and recent conversations with Thomas. She quickly pulled up the regional news website on her laptop, and the headline hit her like a physical blow. "Titan Mining Corporation announces plans for major mineral extraction project near Cheyenne Reservation." The article detailed how Titan Mining had quietly acquired mineral rights to a large tract of land bordering the northern Cheyenne Reservation. The company claimed the area contained significant deposits of rare earth minerals essential for modern technology, and they were planning an open-pit mining operation that would create hundreds of jobs and bring millions of dollars to the local economy. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read further. The proposed mining site included the headwaters of 3 creeks that flowed directly onto reservation land. It also encompassed areas she knew contained ancient burial sites and sacred locations important to the Cheyenne people. Worse yet, the mining would destroy the very ecosystem she had been working to restore. "Dr. Williams," Rebecca said, her voice tight with emotion, "this would be an environmental disaster. The watershed alone, if they contaminate those streams, it would affect thousands of acres of prairie, not to mention the reservation's water supply." "I know, Rebecca. The university is already getting calls from environmental groups asking for our research data. But this is complicated. Titan Mining has all the proper permits, and they're promising significant economic benefits for the region." After hanging up, Rebecca stared at the computer screen, reading through the technical details of the mining proposal. The environmental impact report mentioned her research area only briefly, dismissing the ecological significance with phrases like limited biodiversity and degraded grassland with minimal conservation value. She wanted to scream, "Limited biodiversity?" She had documented over 200 species of plants in that area, many of them rare natives that were finally recovering after decades of damage. The report completely ignored the cultural and spiritual significance of the land to the Cheyenne. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Thomas. Can you meet me at the trading post? Something terrible has happened." Rebecca grabbed her keys and drove faster than she should have across the gravel roads leading to the reservation boundary. She found Thomas sitting on the trading post steps, his head in his hands. His usual calm demeanor was completely gone, replaced by an anguish she had never seen before. "You heard about the mining company," she said. Sitting down beside him, Thomas looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion and frustration. "It's worse than you think. That land they want to mine, it's not just environmentally important. It contains the burial sites of my great-great-grandparents and dozens of other tribal ancestors. There are sacred springs up there that have been used for purification ceremonies for generations." Rebecca felt sick. The environmental report barely mentioned any cultural sites. "Of course it didn't," Thomas said bitterly. "They hired some consultant who spent maybe 2 days walking around with a metal detector. They never talked to any tribal historians or elders. They never asked about oral traditions or sacred locations that aren't marked with visible structures." Thomas explained how he had learned about the mining proposal the night before, when he was called to an emergency meeting of the tribal council. The news had hit the community like a bomb, creating divisions that threatened to tear apart the careful unity the council had worked years to build. "Some of the council members want to file lawsuits immediately," Thomas continued. "Others think we should try negotiating with the company for financial compensation or environmental protections. A few of the younger members are talking about direct action, protests, blockades, whatever it takes to stop this." "What do you think should be done?" Rebecca asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absently touching the pouch that held his grandfather's eagle feather. "I don't know. That's the problem. As a messenger, I'm supposed to help unite the council, to carry words of wisdom between different factions. But I feel lost. How do you find unity when people are scared, angry, and desperate?" He told her about the heated discussions that had gone on until nearly dawn. Elder council members spoke of prophecies about the land being tested, about the need to protect sacred sites at any cost. Middle-aged tribal members worried about economic opportunities for their children, wondering if fighting the mining company would cost the reservation other potential development projects. Younger voices demanded immediate action, frustrated by what they saw as decades of compromise that had accomplished nothing. "And through it all," Thomas said, "I kept thinking about losing my grandfather's feather. Some of the elders are saying it was an omen, that maybe I'm not the right person to help guide the community through this crisis." Rebecca felt her heart break for him. Thomas, that's not fair. You lost something in an accident, and you had the integrity to accept help in getting it back. That shows wisdom, not weakness. Try telling that to Calvin White Elk, Thomas replied. He's one of the traditional council members, very respected, but he's always been skeptical of younger people taking on important roles. He said my carelessness with sacred objects shows I'm not ready for the responsibility of helping to protect sacred land. The weight of the situation was becoming clearer to Rebecca. The mining threat wasn't just about environmental destruction or economic concerns. It was creating a spiritual crisis within the community. People were questioning their leaders, their strategies, and their unity at the moment when they most needed to stand together. Is there anything I can do to help? Rebecca asked carefully. I mean, as an outsider, I don't want to interfere in tribal decisions, but ... Thomas looked at her with something that might have been hope. Actually, there might be. Your research? Data could be crucial for any legal challenge. You've documented the ecological importance of that land better than anyone. You understand the watershed, the plant recovery, the animal habitats. Of course I'll share my research, Rebecca said immediately. But will the tribal council trust scientific data from a non-native researcher? Especially given the history you told me about? That's the question, Thomas admitted. Some council members are automatically suspicious of outside experts, even when they're trying to help. Too many times we've been told that studies and reports would protect our interests, only to have them used against us later. They sat in silence for a while, watching the prairie wind bend the grass in waves. Rebecca was beginning to understand that this crisis was about much more than mining permits and environmental protection. It was about centuries of broken promises, about a people's right to protect their sacred places, about the clash between traditional values and modern economic pressures. Thomas, Rebecca said finally, what if there was a way to combine scientific data with traditional knowledge? What if we could show that Western science and Cheyenne wisdom both point to the same conclusion, that this land is irreplaceable? Thomas turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. What do you mean? Your grandmother's plant knowledge, your grandfather's understanding of the spiritual landscape, the council's historical memories of that area, what if we could document all of that alongside my research? Create something that shows the land's importance from every angle? The council would never allow traditional sacred knowledge to be shared in some mining company's legal proceedings, Thomas said immediately. Not the sacred parts, Rebecca clarified. But the ecological knowledge, the historical significance, the cultural connections that aren't secret or ceremonial, things that could help people understand why this land matters to your people. Thomas was quiet, clearly thinking through the possibilities and the risks. It would be unprecedented, he said finally, and it would require the council to trust. Not just you, but the entire legal system that has failed us so many times before. I know it's a lot to ask, Rebecca said, but maybe that's why our paths crossed when they did. Maybe returning your grandfather's feather wasn't just about earning trust. Maybe it was about building the foundation for something bigger. Thomas looked down at the eagle feather pouch, then back at Rebecca. I need to think about this. And, I need to talk to some of the elders who might be willing to consider a different approach. As Rebecca drove back to her research station that evening, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her quiet scientific study had suddenly become part of something much larger and more important. The data she had been collecting might be the key to protecting not just an ecosystem, but a people's sacred heritage. She spent the night going through her research files, organizing her data, and preparing for what felt like the most important work of her career. Somewhere in those numbers and measurements might be the evidence needed to stop a disaster that would affect generations of people, plants, and animals. Rebecca spent 3 sleepless nights poring over her research data, cross-referencing water quality measurements with plant distribution maps and soil composition charts. Every number told the same story. The proposed mining site was the ecological heart of the entire region. Contaminate those headwaters and the damage would spread like poison through hundreds of square Miles of prairie. She was hunched over her laptop at dawn when her phone rang. It was Thomas, and his voice carried an exhaustion that matched her own. Rebecca, I've been thinking about your idea, combining scientific data with traditional knowledge. I talked to my great-aunt Helen about it. She's one of the most respected elders on the council. Rebecca sat up straighter, suddenly alert despite her fatigue. What did she say? She wants to meet you, Thomas replied. But she made it clear this isn't just a casual conversation. If we're going to ask the council to trust an outsider with something this important, she needs to know who you really are. 2 hours later, Rebecca found herself sitting in a modest living room that felt like stepping into a different world. The walls were decorated with family photographs spanning generations, traditional beadwork, and certificates recognizing Helen Two Bears for her decades of community service. The elderly woman herself was smaller than Rebecca had expected, but her presence filled the room with quiet authority. Thomas tells me you want to help our people fight this mining company, Helen said directly, studying Rebecca with sharp eyes. That seemed to see everything. Why should we trust you? The question was fair, but it caught Rebecca off guard. She had prepared to discuss her research, her environmental data, her scientific credentials. She hadn't prepared to explain why her heart was breaking over the threat to land that wasn't technically hers to protect. I don't know if you should trust me, Rebecca answered honestly. I can only tell you that these past few months working on the prairie have changed how I see everything. This isn't just about plants and animals to me anymore. It's about something sacred that I'm only beginning to understand. Helen's expression didn't change, but she gestured for Rebecca to continue. When I first came here, I thought I was just documenting grass recovery and soil health, Rebecca went on. But Thomas has been teaching me to see the land the way your people do, as something alive, something that tells stories, something that connects the past to the future. The thought of that mining company destroying it feels like watching someone burn down a library full of irreplaceable books. Helen was quiet for a long time, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Finally, she spoke in Cheyenne to Thomas, who nodded and responded in the same language. Rebecca sat patiently, knowing this conversation was too important to rush. My nephew says you returned his grandfather's eagle feather without expecting anything in return, Helen said to Rebecca. He also says you listen more than you talk, which is rare among your people. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. I have a lot to learn. Yes, you do, Helen agreed matter-of-factly. But maybe that's why the spirits brought you here at this time. Someone who knows they don't have all? The answers might be willing to learn from others. Over the next 2 hours, Helen shared stories that made Rebecca's scientific training seem suddenly limited. She described how her own grandmother could predict weather patterns by watching the behavior of grasshoppers and meadowlarks. She explained how certain plants only grew in areas where the water table was at exactly the right depth, and how indigenous people had used this knowledge to find reliable water sources for thousands of years. The mining company's report says our land has limited environmental value, Helen said with bitter humor. But they don't know how to read what the land is telling them. They see empty space where we see a complex system that took centuries to develop. Rebecca pulled out her research notes, but Helen held up a hand to stop her. I don't need to see your numbers to know you understand the land better than most outsiders, the elder said. Thomas has told me how you work, how you notice the small things, how you track changes over time, how you see connections between different parts of the ecosystem. But that's exactly what I want to share with the tribal council, Rebecca said eagerly. My research proves scientifically what your people have always known, that this land is incredibly valuable and that mining would destroy something irreplaceable. Helen nodded slowly. The question isn't whether your research is good. The question is whether the council will accept help from someone outside our community, especially when that help comes from the same kind of institutions that have failed us before. Thomas leaned forward from his chair near the window. And Helen, what if Rebecca didn't present her research as an outside expert coming in to save us? What if she presented it as someone who learned from our people and wants to support our fight? The old woman's eyes sharpened with interest. What do you mean? Rebecca's data is strongest when it's combined with traditional knowledge, Thomas explained. Her soil samples make sense because of what grandmother's generation taught about plant relationships. Her water quality measurements matter because they confirm what our ancestors knew about the sacred springs. Rebecca began to see where Thomas was heading. You mean present the research not as separate scientific evidence, but as modern confirmation of traditional Cheyenne knowledge? Exactly, Thomas said, excitement building in his voice. Show the council that Western science has finally caught up to what our people always understood about this land. Helen sat back in her chair, considering this idea. It would require the council to trust not just your research, but your intentions. Some of our people have been burned too many times by promises from government scientists and university researchers. I understand that, Rebecca said. What would it take to earn that trust? Time we don't have, Helen replied bluntly. The mining company is pushing for fast approval of their permits. They want to start preliminary work before winter. Thomas stood up and began pacing, his mind clearly racing. What if we ask the council to let Rebecca address them directly? Not as an expert witness, but as someone who wants to stand with us against this threat? Helen's eyebrows rose. A non-native person addressing the full tribal council? That would be unprecedented. So is a mining company trying to destroy our most sacred sites, Thomas shot back. Maybe unprecedented times call for unprecedented actions. Rebecca felt her heart pounding. The thought of speaking to the tribal council was terrifying, but it also felt right in a way she couldn't fully explain. I would be honored by that opportunity, she said quietly. But only if the council truly wanted to hear from me, not because anyone felt pressured to include an outsider. Helen studied Rebecca's face for another long moment. There would be conditions. You would need to understand that this isn't just about environmental protection, it's about our survival as a people. You would need to accept that some council members might never trust you, no matter what you say. I understand, Rebecca replied. And you would need to be prepared for the possibility that your involvement might make things harder for us, Helen continued. The mining company and their lawyers will try to use your presence against us. They'll claim we needed outside help because our own arguments weren't strong enough. Thomas stopped pacing and looked at his great-aunt. Or they could see that our cause is so just that even outsiders are willing to risk their careers to support us. Helen smiled for the first time since Rebecca had arrived. You sound like your grandfather when you talk like that. He always believed the best way to honor our ancestors was to adapt their wisdom to new challenges. She turned back to Rebecca. If you're serious about this, you need to understand what you're asking to be part of. This isn't just about stopping a mining project. We're fighting for our right to protect our sacred places, our right to have our voices heard in decisions that affect our land, our right to exist as a people with our own values and traditions. I'm beginning to understand that, Rebecca said. And I want to be part of that fight if you'll have me. Helen nodded slowly. Then we need to prepare you properly. You'll need to learn more about our history, our relationship to this land, and why this battle matters so much to our people. And you'll need to be ready to combine your scientific knowledge with our traditional wisdom in a way that honors both. Over the following week, Rebecca found herself immersed in a crash course in Cheyenne history and culture. Helen arranged for her to meet with other elders, historians, and traditional knowledge keepers who were willing to share non-sacred information about their connection to the threatened land. She learned about the seasonal rounds that had brought Cheyenne families to those specific areas for generations. She discovered that the sacred springs weren't just religiously important. They were crucial stopping points on traditional travel routes and had sustained the people during times of drought and displacement. Most importantly, she began to understand how her scientific data could support rather than replace traditional knowledge. Her measurements of water flow patterns confirmed oral histories about reliable water sources. Her documentation of plant recovery validated traditional teachings about. The morning of the tribal council meeting arrived with an unusual stillness across the prairie. Rebecca woke before dawn, her stomach churning with nerves. She had addressed scientific conferences, presented research to university committees, and defended her doctoral thesis, but none of those experiences had prepared her for this moment. Thomas picked her up, just as the sun began painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He looked as nervous as she felt, constantly adjusting his grandfather's eagle feather where it was attached to his shirt pocket. "How are you feeling?" he asked as they drove toward the community center where the council would meet. "Like I might throw up," Rebecca admitted. "What if I say something wrong? What if I accidentally offend someone or use the wrong words?" Thomas managed a weak smile. "Aunt Helen told me something yesterday that I think you should know. She said the fact that you're scared shows you understand how important this is. Someone who wasn't nervous wouldn't truly grasp what's at stake." The community center was already bustling with activity when they arrived. Rebecca had expected a formal meeting room, but instead found a large circular space where folding chairs had been arranged in traditional council formation. People of all ages were gathering, elderly council members with braided hair and wearing their best traditional clothing, middle-aged parents juggling crying babies in work clothes, teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Helen Two Bears approached them near the entrance. She wore a beautiful beaded dress and carried herself with the dignity Rebecca had come to associate with the tribal elders. "Are you ready, child?" Helen asked Rebecca, her voice kind but serious. "As ready as I can be," Rebecca replied, clutching her folder of research materials. "Remember what we practiced?" Helen said. "Speak from your heart first, then share your numbers. These people need to know you care about more than just data." As the meeting began, Rebecca watched the council's traditional opening ceremony with deep respect. Prayers were offered in Cheyenne, sage was burned to purify the space, and the eagle feather was passed among the speakers as they each shared their thoughts on the mining threat. When Thomas rose to address the council, Rebecca felt her heart swell with pride for her friend. Gone was the uncertain young man who had worried about losing his grandfather's feather. In his place stood someone who spoke with quiet confidence and obvious love for his people. "Council members, elders, friends," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "We face a threat that could destroy not just our land, but our connection to our ancestors and our ability to pass on our traditions to future generations." He spoke about the sacred sites that would be destroyed, the water sources that would be contaminated, and the cultural losses that could never be replaced. But then he surprised Rebecca by talking about hope. "I stand before you today because of something that happened 3 weeks ago," Thomas continued. "I lost my grandfather's eagle feather, the symbol of my responsibility to serve this community." "I thought I had failed you all," murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some council members nodded with understanding, while others looked concerned. "But the Creator works in mysterious ways," Thomas went on. "That feather was found and returned to me by someone who has become a true friend to our people, Dr. Rebecca. Chun is here today not as an outsider telling us what to do, but as someone who has learned to see our land through our eyes." The room fell completely silent as Thomas gestured for Rebecca to stand. Her legs felt shaky as she walked to the center of the circle, but Helen's encouraging nod gave her strength. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," Rebecca began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Thank you for this honor. I know I'm not Cheyenne, and I know my presence here is unusual." She looked around the circle, meeting as many eyes as she could. 3 months ago, I came to your lands to study grass recovery. I thought I was just a scientist doing research. But working on the prairie, learning from Thomas and Helen Two Bears and other members of your community, has taught me that science without wisdom is incomplete." Rebecca pulled out her first chart showing the water flow patterns from the proposed mining site. "My research confirms what your ancestors have always known, that the springs and streams in the mining area are the lifeblood of this entire region. If Titan mining contaminates those headwaters, the poison will flow for generations." She moved through her data methodically, but tried to connect each scientific finding to traditional knowledge she had learned. Her soil composition analysis supported elder teachings about which areas were most fertile. Her plant surveys confirmed oral histories about where certain medicines grew best. But this isn't just about numbers, Rebecca said, setting aside her charts. Helen Two Bears taught me that your people don't separate the health of the land from the health of the community. When I look at my data now, I don't just see measurements. I see a living system that your families have been part of for countless generations. Calvin White Elk, the traditional council member who had questioned Thomas's worthiness, raised his hand to speak. Rebecca's heart sank, expecting criticism. "Dr. Chun," he said formally, "you speak of learning from our people. But what do you gain from helping us fight this mining company? What do you want in return?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire. Rebecca realized this was the moment that would determine everything, not just whether the council would accept her help, but whether the trust she and Thomas had built could bridge the gap between their worlds. "I don't want anything in return," Rebecca said simply, "except maybe the chance to keep learning from all of you. The prairie has become my teacher too. The thought of watching it be destroyed for corporate profit makes me sick to my stomach." She paused, feeling emotion well up in her throat. "Your ancestors understood things about this land that my university textbooks never taught me. If we lose this fight, we don't just lose an ecosystem, we lose thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to live in harmony with the natural world." An elderly woman in the back row stood up. Rebecca recognized her as Dorothy Spotted Elk, one of the most respected traditionalists in the community. "I have a question for Thomas Crowfeather," Dorothy said. "You lost your grandfather's sacred feather, but this woman returned it to you. Do you believe that was an accident, or do you believe the spirits guided her to find it?" Thomas touched the eagle feather at his chest, considering his answer carefully. "Grandmother Dorothy, I believe the spirits work through people who open their hearts to wisdom." Rebecca could have kept that feather or ignored it completely. Instead, she treated it with the respect it deserved and made sure it came home. "And now she offers to stand with us against those who would destroy our sacred places," Dorothy continued. "Perhaps the feather was meant to create this alliance." The room buzzed with quiet conversation as council members discussed Dorothy's words in small groups. Rebecca stood in the center, feeling simultaneously exposed and supported, terrified and determined. Finally, the head of the tribal council, Chairman Robert Little-Volf, called for order. "We have heard from Thomas Crowfeather and from Dr. Chun. Now we must decide how to proceed against this mining threat." The debate that followed was intense but respectful. Some council members argued for immediate legal action, using Rebecca's research as evidence in federal court. Others preferred negotiating with Titan Mining to minimize environmental damage. A few younger voices still called for direct protest action. Through it all, Rebecca noticed something remarkable happening. Instead of the angry divisions Thomas had described from earlier meetings, the council members were listening to each other. They were finding common ground in their shared determination to protect their land. Chairman Little-Volf stood as the discussion wound down. "I believe we have reached a decision," he said solemnly. "We will fight this mining project with every legal tool available to us. Dr. Chun's research will be crucial to our case, and we accept her offer to testify on our behalf." The room erupted in applause and expressions of approval. But the chairman wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "we recognize that Dr. Chun has shown the respect and dedication that defines a true friend of our people. The council votes to offer her an honorary Cheyenne name, White Buffalo Woman Who Returns What Is Sacred." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as the council members came forward to shake her hand and welcome her more formally into their community. Thomas appeared at her side, grinning widely. "How does it feel to have a Cheyenne name?" he asked, overwhelming. Rebecca managed through her tears. "And perfect." 6 months later, Rebecca stood on the same prairie ridge where she had first seen Thomas riding with his grandfather's eagle feather. The legal battle had been long and difficult, but their combined efforts, scientific research supporting traditional knowledge, environmental law reinforced by cultural protection statutes, had succeeded. Titan Mining had withdrawn their proposal. After facing overwhelming evidence that the project would cause irreparable harm, Thomas joined her on the ridge, as he often did these days. Their friendship had deepened into something that felt like family, not. 3 days had passed since Rebecca returned the eagle feather, but she couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Thomas. His words about the land and traditional knowledge kept echoing in her mind as she worked in the field. She found herself looking at the prairie differently now, wondering what stories the old-timers would tell about each plant and animal she documented. On Thursday morning, she was surprised to see a familiar figure approaching her research site on foot. Thomas walked across the grassland with the easy stride of someone completely comfortable in this environment. He carried a small backpack and wore a different expression than she remembered, more relaxed, more confident. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," he called out as he got closer. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. In our culture, returning something sacred isn't taken lightly." Rebecca looked up from her data sheets, genuinely pleased to see him again. "No interruption at all. I was actually hoping I might run into you again. I keep thinking about what you said about traditional plant knowledge." Thomas smiled and gestured toward her equipment. "Mind if I see what you're working on? I'm curious about how your science looks at things my grandmother taught me as a kid." For the next hour, Rebecca walked Thomas through her research plots, explaining how she measured grass recovery, soil health, and biodiversity. She showed him her data on which native species were thriving and which were struggling to reestablish themselves after years of damage. "This is fascinating," Thomas said, crouching down to examine a cluster of prairie sage. "My grandmother, Helen Tubers, she was like a walking encyclopedia of plant medicine. She could tell you which grasses would grow back first after a drought, which flowers meant the soil was healing, which roots could cure stomach problems." Rebecca pulled out her field notebook, suddenly excited. "Would you mind sharing some of that knowledge? I mean, if it's appropriate to discuss with an outsider." Thomas considered this carefully. Some things are sacred and meant only for our people. But the basic plant knowledge, the things that help the land heal, I think my grandmother would want that shared with someone who cares like you do. They sat on a fallen log, and Thomas began pointing out plants that Rebecca had cataloged but never fully understood. He told her about sweetgrass and how it was used in ceremonies to purify and invite good spirits. He explained how buffalo berry bush were indicators of healthy soil, and how certain wildflowers only bloomed when the prairie ecosystem was in proper balance. The old people, they didn't separate science from spirituality the way modern folks do, Thomas explained. To them, understanding how plants worked was understanding how the Creator designed the world to heal itself. Rebecca found herself taking notes faster than she had in years. This wasn't just folklore. It was sophisticated ecological knowledge, developed over centuries of careful observation. Thomas described plant relationships her textbooks had never mentioned, seasonal patterns her professors had never taught, and natural cycles that her equipment couldn't measure, but that indigenous people had relied on for generations. "I wish I could have met your grandmother," Rebecca said sincerely. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman." Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "She was. She passed 5 years ago, but she taught me so much. She always said the land would teach you everything you needed to know if you learned how to listen to it properly." "Is that why you became a messenger for the tribal council?" Rebecca asked. "Because of that connection to traditional knowledge?" Thomas nodded, unconsciously touching the pouch where he kept his grandfather's eagle feather. "Both my grandparents served their community in different ways. Grandmother was a healer and teacher. Grandfather was a spiritual leader and advisor to the council. When they died, I felt called to carry on that service, but in my own way." He explained how his role worked, traveling between different communities on the reservation, bringing messages from the council, checking on elderly tribal members, and helping coordinate community events and ceremonies. It wasn't an official job with a salary, but rather a calling that earned respect and trust within the tribe. "The eagle feather you returned, it's not just a symbol," Thomas continued. When my grandfather gave it to me, he said it would help me carry the responsibility with honor. Losing it felt like I was failing in that duty. Rebecca began to understand the deeper significance of their first meeting. So when you lost the feather, it wasn't just about losing a family heirloom. Exactly. Some of the council elders are traditional people who believe strongly in signs and omens. If they thought I couldn't even keep track of my grandfather's sacred feather, how could they trust me with important messages? How could they believe I was worthy of representing our people? Thomas picked up a handful of prairie soil, letting it run through his fingers as he spoke. Our community faces so many challenges. We're trying to preserve our culture while adapting to the modern world. We're fighting to protect our land and resources while also finding ways to provide economic opportunities for young people. The council needs messengers they can trust completely. And now? Rebecca asked gently. Thomas smiled, and she could see the confidence that had been missing during their first meeting. Now I feel like my grandfather's spirit guided you to find that feather. Maybe it was meant to test whether I would give up when faced with loss or whether I would find strength in unexpected places. They spent the rest of the morning walking the prairie together, with Thomas sharing more traditional knowledge and Rebecca explaining her scientific findings. She learned about plants used for dyes, medicines, and food. He learned about soil, chemistry, water cycles, and climate change impacts on native species. You know, Thomas said as they paused near a small creek, this kind of collaboration used to be more common. My great-grandfather told stories about the early researchers who came here. Some of them worked closely with tribal knowledge keepers. They understood that indigenous people had been studying this land for thousands of years. Rebecca felt a deep sense of purpose forming. What happened to that collaboration? Politics. Mistrust. Too many researchers who took our knowledge without giving credit or sharing benefits with the community. Too many promises broken by government agencies and universities, Thomas said matter-of-factly. A lot of our elders became protective of traditional knowledge because it had been exploited before. I understand that, Rebecca said. Trust has to be earned, especially when there's been a history of harm. Thomas studied her face for a long moment. You're different from the other researchers who've come through here. You listen more than you talk. You ask permission instead of just taking. You return something sacred when you could have kept it. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew warmer, they made their way back toward Rebecca's research site. The conversation had created something neither of them had expected: a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared passion for the land. Would you be interested in meeting some of our elders? Thomas asked as they reached her equipment. There are a few who might be willing to share more traditional knowledge with someone they trust. Rebecca felt honored by the suggestion. I would be deeply grateful for that opportunity. But only if it's truly welcomed and only if there's some way I can give back to the community, Thomas grinned. Actually, there might be. The council has been discussing ways to document traditional ecological knowledge before more of the elders pass on. Having a trained scientist who understands both approaches could be valuable. Neither of them realized it yet, but this conversation was laying the groundwork for something much larger than either imagined. The trust being built between a botanist and a tribal messenger would soon become crucial for their entire community's survival. As Thomas prepared to leave, he pulled out his grandfather's eagle feather one more time, holding it up to catch the prairie wind. Thank you again, he said simply, for returning this and for understanding what it really means. Rebecca watched him walk away across the grassland. Feeling that her research had taken on a dimension she had never anticipated. She was no longer just studying the prairie's recovery, she was becoming part of its story.